Good evening, everybody. My name is Jean Hogue. I'm presently now the mayor of Survey. I was just elected in July of this year, 2008, excuse me, to be mayor of Survey. That was quite an honor. I had a lot of help, and very proud to be mayor of Old Survey. My people came here in the 20s. My grandfather, Norwood Strickland, came from Bainbridge, Georgia. He had a sawmill there, and he had taken a contract with the United States government to build spars for sailing vessels in World War I for the sailing ships. And he had many on train beds, on the tracks, ready to go to the bases when the war ended, and the United States government reneged on their contract, and my grandfather went bankrupt. So consequently, he came to Bonita Springs, and he put in a sawmill out on Beach Road, just west of the railroad tracks on the north side of the road, on Beach Road. When they came here, he had a family of 6, my father being the oldest son, and this was in 1925, and he purchased a home up on Terry Street, on East Terry, the first house on the right. It's a 2-story house. It's kind of mustardy yellow, and it's across from the Leitner home. And it was, to me as a child, it was just a mansion. It was 2-story, and there were never less than 15 people at the house. As I said, my grandfather had 6 children, and a couple of them were married. There were always cousins, boy cousins, that came to live with us so that they could work at the mill to help my grandfather at the sawmill. And so this was a big house with a lot of people. I know a lot of people in town probably thought we were very rich because we lived in this fine home that Mr. Ed Agner built, who also built the United Methodist Church in Bonita Springs, which is the first and oldest church in Bonita. But he built this home on East Terry, and my grandfather purchased it, and in it was it had 1 bedroom downstairs, 2 bedrooms upstairs, and what they called the dormitory. And in that dormitory, there probably was 6, 7 beds, and that's where all the guys slept. And I was born there, and my mother and dad were married, and we lived there with my grandparents. And my dad worked the sawmill with his father, along with his brothers. It was an enchanted life. It really was, because Bonita was so small at that time. As Don said, maybe 200 people lived here. Very small town. The shell factory was here, and like he said, it did provide industry for a lot of people. For people, women that worked from their homes, like he said, they would take stuff home and do it. But my mother had often told me that there were many days when she would make almost 50 biscuits for breakfast. There'd be that many people for breakfast. And a typical breakfast was like the main meal. You'd have pork chops or sausage or eggs and maybe fried chicken. It was just a huge meal because the men got up so early and they had to go to the woods, cut the timbers, and haul them in on these big old trucks and these big old timbers, and it was just very hard work. And then at around 1 o'clock, the men would come back in for their noon meal. And there again, it would be, the table would just be falling down with food. Just food forever. It seemed like a child, like me. And I often wondered later in life why we did not die with ptomaine poisoning, because all we had was an ice box, And so my grandmother would she always had a beautiful white linen tablecloth on this huge table. Seemed like it went from here to the back. Probably 15 people could sit at it. And she'd take all the food and she'd put it on one end of the table, and she'd turn that tablecloth back over it so the flies wouldn't get on it. And that's how that would stay until supper time. And then at supper time, it would all be moved back. It would not be heated up. Sometime we'd eat buttermilk and cornbread and buttermilk and biscuits and whatever else was on the table. Like I said, there was a lot of people to feed there. And there was very little money, very little money. And my dad, when he would get home from work, excuse me, I'm just trying to get over bronchial pneumonia. When he would get home from work, he would go right behind our house to the Lightner Creek, which ran right behind our house, came right off of Imperial River and right behind our house. And he would fish. And he would catch fish, and my mama and grandmama would cook them. Or he would go to the woods, like Don said, you could just walk out here, you know, half a mile. He'd kill turkey, deer, rabbits, squirrels,
Wild hogs.
doves. We never did, I don't remember us eating hogs, but doves, quail, things like that. We always had plenty of food. And then when he wanted to, when he had time, he'd go to the beach and he would get saltwater fish. He'd get mullet and snook and things like that. So there was just an abundance of food, it seemed like to me. We never went hungry. My grandmother had a chicken yard, if any of you know what a chicken yard is, with fenced in, and she had coops for her chickens and her hens and that laid eggs. And she had some chickens that roosted in the trees. And we had a milk cow, and we had oranges, and we had mangoes. And so there was just, you know, just always was plenty of food for this large group of people that stayed at our house. And during the 1936 flood, all of Bonita flooded. And that house on East Terry is probably 4 foot off the ground, and it was one of the few houses that did not flood. And my dad said we had 26 people there staying with us that were in houses that had flooded. And so there again, he had to take a boat. And he came down to Lahan's grocery. And when he got here by boat from up on Terry Street, he rode down here, the Red Cross had come in, and they took all the food to what they call the people that were in need. Well, here was little Bonita down here at the end of the road with nothing and no way to get anything. And both grocery stores had been emptied by the Red Cross and the food taken elsewhere. My dad said the water came up to the bar in the tavern over here at where I danced on the bar.
Now this is the honest program. Gotta be, this is honest now.
But anyway, in the Bamboo Tavern, which was then Baird's, the bar, Daddy said the water came right up to the bar. Couldn't sit down at the bar because the water was to it. You couldn't even get in hardly, the door. But like I said, it was just an enchanted life. And some of the stories with my grandmother, after dinner at noon, she always wore an apron. Always. I never remember her without an apron on. And I never remember her in pants. I never saw her in pants. Always a dress. Very much the lady. And after we'd have our dinner, I guess my mother cleaned up. I don't remember that part of it. But my grandmother would take my brother and I and the Alvarez children across the street and the Krant children from the shell factory. And we would walk east on Terry Street, which was just a rut road up to where there was a spring. Like Don said, there were many springs in Bonita at that time. And she always carried a tin cup in her pocket of her apron. And as we would walk up this rut road, she'd tell us wonderful stories of animals and birds and leaves, and you know how grannies are. I'm a great granny now, so anyway, she would also, on the pine trees, there's a white sap that runs on the pine trees. And she would peel that off and she would give it to us and tell us to chew it. And that was our chewing gum to clean our teeth after we had eaten our lunch. And then when we get to the spring, she'd gather us all around and everybody would get a drink of this wonderful spring cold water. And it was just such a treat. Every day we did this, every day. And in 37, 38, I forget just which, our sawmill burned to the ground in the middle of the night one night, which is not unusual for old sawmills back then. They burned frequently. And my grandfather rebuilt, and we did have a few blacks that lived on the property, one or two. There were a couple of little houses there that the blacks lived in. And they came running all the way from the mill, all the way up to the house to get our people because the mill was on fire. But it was not to be saved. And my grandfather built again, and it burned a second time. And with that, he gave up, and I think probably he died of a broken heart. But anyway, changing the subject a little bit, Charlie said something about talking about Cordell Smith a little bit. I remember Cordell very well. He was such a quaint man, always in a pair of overalls, long sleeve, long to the ground, button up the front overalls, either barefoot or in tennis shoes, high-top tennis shoes. And he ran mostly. He ran. Wherever he went, he would run. And most of the irrigation ditches in Bonita that run to the Imperial, Cordell dug those by hand. To keep Auntie Alice's feet dry, as he said. Auntie Alice was his aunt that came here from the north, and that's the reason he dug these ditches. He had a wonderful farm down where Walgreens is on Beach Road. He ran all the way down there every day and worked in that garden. And then he would run back for his lunch, and then he'd run back. And a lot of times my husband said he would run naked. I don't know that for a fact, but that's what he would tell me. If he got really hot and he was really sweaty, he would just run naked. But in 1960, September the 9th, I believe it was, John and I had gotten up that morning and there was warnings of Hurricane Donna. And beautiful like today, not as cool, but just a beautiful September day. And of course we had 3 children and we had his granny with us, his 90-year-old granny was living with us. And I told him, I said, you reckon I ought to go down and get some food in, you know, for this hurricane? It's just really strange, this weather's so beautiful. And he said, well, I don't know, maybe you better, you know. So I went down to Lahan's, and there at the store sat Mr. Cordell Smith, and he was such a gentleman always. He would get up and bow even to a young woman like I was then, in my 20s. He'd bow to me, oh, Miss Jean. And I said, well, Cordell, I said, do you really and truly think we're going to have a hurricane? And he said, oh, Miss Jean, he said, you see these cats? And there must have been 8 or 10 cats there. And those cats were just about to turn inside out. Never seen anything like it. They were climbing the walls, they were rolling over. Just the strangest thing you've ever seen. And he said, you see these cats, Miss Jean? He said, we're going to have a hurricane. Good, I thought. And I went on in the store and got a few groceries and went home. And Granny and I sat up that night until midnight, and the weatherman said, the last thing I remember him saying is, we have lost the hurricane. And with that I said, you old goat, and I turned off the TV and went to bed, because I thought, how can you lose a hurricane? But anyway, the next morning before, just at daylight, my children had a swing set in the backyard. And just at daylight, my two boys came in and they were down on their knees and they were tapping on the bed. Mama, Mama. And I said, what? I said, the trees are down on our swing set. I said, no, couldn't be, they've heard me talking, and they're just, this is what they're thinking. I said, no, go back to bed, it's too early yet. No, Mama, get up, Mama, the trees are down on our swing set. So I did, I got up and went out, and sure enough, the trees, the huge, big mango tree had already collapsed over onto their swing set. And from there, it really did blow, and it blew for 12, 13 hours, except for the eye, which was a couple hours long, I guess, wasn't it, Byron? The longest eye I have ever seen, really and truly. But I often think of Cordell when I think of a hurricane. This old man knew more than the weather people, all the scientists, and all that. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Byron now and let him tell you a few stories.